Coincidental.
Chapter 6. Present Culture and its Case Against Christianity. If God does not exist, everything is permissible, argues the atheist. On the empirical level of human existence, as Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov shows, the logical consistency of this thesis refutes itself. For if everything is permissible, murder is a legitimate action, and consequently, suicide is the only authentic act. But life precisely contradicts this thesis. Therefore, the Christian argues, life is not an absurd labyrinth of permissible speculations about abstract acts. It is the unfolding, now bright, now dark, now hopeful, now desperate, now meaningful, now meaningless, of a single action, namely that everything is grace because there is a God. Thus the Christian states his position: God is, therefore all is grace. Modern man is the legatee of the Christian as well as of the atheist. He agrees with the Christian that all is grace. He agrees with the atheist that God is dead. His argument is, all is grace, therefore God is dead. For if life is meaningless, then there must be no God. But if it is meaningful, and it must be, or else it contradicts itself, it is meaningful by virtue of some kind of immanent grace, therefore God does not exist. If all is grace, then God is dead. Or, all is grace because God is dead. God is, therefore all is grace. Jacques Maritain is too much of a Thomist to show any signs of perplexity or anxiety in his philosophy. Not that Maritain knows nothing of the despair, the cruelty, and the irrationalism peculiar to this age. But his confidence in the supernatural hope of his faith compels him to regard these as mere signs of a degeneration, of a fall from a period of culture impregnated by grace to one which can be but transitory. The degradation and shame of the present epoch is for Maritain sufficient proof of the need for a new Christian approach to the problems of modern society. He is firmly convinced that the structures of the new era can be built on Christian foundations, especially redefined for this purpose. But his understanding of Christianity and his definition of its role in framing this new culture are so broad that one cannot help but realize the ambivalence of his conviction. Maritain is saying that so long as Christianity has not been positively replaced by another religion, it will continue to exist. This is a truism, but so long as it continues simply to exist, it will merely be tolerated. There is a huge difference between the position of Christianity in Maritain's view and that of the early Christians. Maritain declares, "Apportet heresis esse," there must be heresies, while the early Christians were told, "Non licet vos esse," you are not permitted to exist. Whatever one wishes to make of this difference, it asserts that Christianity has lost its hegemony. All it can hope for, from the heresies it must tolerate, is to be tolerated also by them. Christianity cannot hope to survive if it is opposed to life itself. It must compose itself to the facts of the world. It may well be that the frustrated expectation of the second coming, entertained by St. Paul's correspondents, is only now coming to maturity and to fruition. The hope of the imminent parousia implied the abandon of a concern about this world. Grace could be found fully only in the future life, not in this one. The obvious delay of the second coming forced Christianity to regard this world in a somewhat different light. Under the aegis of the medieval synthesis, grace was defined not as the abolishing, but as the perfecting of nature. This view did not quite eliminate the old contempt for the world vividly expressed by the expectation of an imminent return of Jesus. It simply subordinated nature to grace and created a scale of values between them. In this subordination, grace is everything, but everything is not grace. Maritain attempts to say that everything is grace. In the world of the novel, this attempt seems to succeed and become fully realized. There, too, the last palpitation of a Christian culture can be felt. To say that everything is grace often is another way of saying that the traditional Christian subordination of nature to grace is no longer viable. Tortured, and sometimes eccentric, if not despairingly hopeless, the novelist who is also a Christian shows that Christianity is unable to make sense today unless it protests against itself as against its own structures and its own achievements. Even if theologically speaking, Christianity must protest against itself if it wishes to remain authentic, it is nonetheless ironic that this means that Christianity is to be found nowhere, not even within its own precincts. What many contemporary novelists are describing is Christianity's alienation from itself. This self-alienation creates no new act of cultural and social awareness except privately and individually. One must always begin with individuals, but individual Christians can change the world only if they are alienated from the world and if they are not self-alienated. They cannot exculpate themselves from the secularization of Christianity. There cannot be any form of Christianity in exile, as captive peoples set up governments in exile. Rather, it is to Formosa, in relation to the Chinese mainland, that Christianity should be compared in its relation to the modern culture and the course it is taking. Paul Claudel was a man of letters in whose inspiration Christianity took the shape of a glorified Formosa, always acting as if nothing had shaken the mainland of Western culture. Such writers, say Barbulon de Sublime, observed Georges Bernanos, il se mettent du sublime partout, forgetting that Christendom had more in common with the lowly and the disinherited than with the Renaissance palaces or with the imagination of those all too secular painters who painted the Holy Virgin after their mistresses. Inflationary Christianity is possible only when there has been a recession of faith. Any exhibition is then received as a genuine expression of belief. This inflationary vision of Christianity has often resuscitated a Baroque style, especially in literature. Like the Baroque architecture of the 16th century, it is more of a concession to the forces of secularism than an instrument of God's glorification. Unable to maintain its identity in a world dominated by hostile ideologies, it pretends to ignore all hostility in the name of a love too zealous not to suggest the protest of a betrayer. To quote again Bernanos, one does not lose faith, it simply ceases to inform one's life. But people continue to act as if this has not happened. A few novelists have realized the precarious position of Christianity and the struggle that goes on today to capture man's allegiance. Christianity is one among several rivals, and is reduced to the dimensions of an ideology. It is not less corrupt than the forces it tries to combat. In its appeal to modern man, it presents its demands as easier to fulfill than those of its opponents. Modern Christianity has come considerably closer to man's desires and appetites than did traditional Christianity, but it has in the process degraded itself to the level of an opiate or that of moralism. Its God is easier to satisfy. According to Bernanos, religion itself is the major cause of this corruption within Christianity. The Christian Bernanos analyzes the situation in the same way as Samuel Beckett. In both The Diary of a Country Priest and Waiting for Godot, one is struck with the analogy of their revelation about the present state of Christianity. A sign of hope, from the Christian perspective, remains in Bernanos' novel, while it is absent from Beckett's play. But Bernanos' priest cuts a different figure from that of the ordinary priest in respects other than those that would come to one's mind. It is not the intense spiritual concern of a Bernanos priest which puts him in another category, nor is it his love for his mission and the obligations with regard to others that cause him to develop which singularize him. More deeply, it is his fight, not against the decay of society or the corruption of morals, or simply what would be called the world, but against Christianity itself. Mutatis mutandis, his struggle presents the same characteristics as that of Graham Greene's whiskey priest in The Power and the Glory. The association of these two figures is not far-fetched. Greene's priest is externally fighting against a pagan or anti-Christian organization of society. But internally, he is not less concerned about the lack of spiritual resources within Christianity. His behavior is not merely the behavior of an odd priest whose eccentricity has gone too far. His addiction to alcohol is a weakness, perhaps, but it is also a sign of the need for a new inspiration. His illegitimate child may be a symbol of a moral aberration. It is also a live reminder that Christianity cannot go on self-complacently. It must begin again, start all over, especially if its spiritual reserves have been exhausted and cannot create anything new. The child is a sign of the need for a new beginning, so radically new that it shocks even the Christian who should know better. It would be a mistake to read Graham Greene's novel only as a vindication of traditional Christianity and its struggle with a newfangled ideology committing all kinds of crimes in the most tyrannical manner. The struggle is not external, between Christianity and the world, but internal, within Christianity itself, against itself. Bernanos' priest can be put side by side with Greene's. The corruption outside cannot be fought while there is corruption inside. First to be eradicated is the corruption within. Both novelists approach the problem of Christianity's position in today's culture from this angle. Greene's priest looks outside into the enemy, and sees there what he would find as a lack or as a tumor within Christianity. Bernanos' priest looks inside himself, but his sins and his failures are not only personal, they describe the paralysis of the Christian faith itself. By means of their analysis of the priest's predicament, both Bernanos and Greene descend into the human struggle to learn other things besides despair and love, that a man can be unwelcome even in his own home. Here it is not the priest's fate that is of interest. Faith can be unwelcome even in Christianity. Such Christianity is no better than rubbish. In The Power and the Glory, there is a scene in which the whiskey priest drops his case on a heap of rubbish. A whole important and respected youth dropped among the cans. He had been given this case by his parishioners in conception on the 5th anniversary of his ordination. The scene, drawn in the post-war Italian cinematographic school of realism, is followed by a confrontation between the humanly and ecclesiastically illegitimate father and his daughter. Immediately, he feels aware of his own desperate inadequacy. His inadequacy is more than a sign of humility. It represents the fact that the kind of faith for which he stands, in spite of the enemies without as well as within, is on the verge of extinction. Inadequate, he might as well have ceased to live. Where he was going, it would be as if God and all the space between the sea and the mountains ceased to exist. The present is a time of transition. Things seem to remain unchanged, and yet they pass, just as in the revolutionary Mexico of Graham Greene's novel still stands churches and buildings of a time now past. One can pass these churches by, as if they are there, but in them there is no life. They pass the whitewashed church that too belonged to a dream. Life didn't contain churches. Greene's priest can, now that life does not contain churches, have faith because he no longer has any reasons to have faith. He can count on the grace of God, not because his shortcomings make it even more necessary, but because they do not make it necessary at all. For him, all is grace because he has practically ceased to wear his clerical garb. But those for whom life still contains churches continue to believe that religion consists in avoiding social changes and protecting the family and defending the status quo, and believing that life must be centered around the church no matter what the church is like. It is this kind of religion that Bernanos attacks in The Diary of a Country Priest. The sophisticated priest of this religion may be quite eloquent and a staunch defender of law and order. He may criticize the passion to change society for the sake of changing it, but he is at the same time the chief culprit of the secularization of Western culture. Bernanos was not mistaken. Though the world of his novels is darkness and light in such a way that the light makes darkness even darker, he realized that the most potent enemy of faith was not the secular mind as such, but its creator, the sophisticated priest full of wind. The priest who descends from the pulpit of truth with a mouth like a hen's vent, a little hot but pleased with himself, he's not been preaching. At best, he's been purring like a tabby cat. Later in the same novel, Bernanos says more explicitly, what's wrong with the clergy? Not much, except that they have secularized us. That is to say, they have alienated Christianity and Western culture from each other. There is no longer, adds Bernanos, there will no longer be any Christendom. Contrast Bernanos' dialogue between the priest and a faithful named Arsène, and the story of Caesarea Philippi in the New Testament. In the latter, Jesus asks his disciples what kind of rumor goes on about him. Then he adds, "And you, who do you say that I am?" Peter immediately answers, and his answer is well known. "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." The confession of Peter, cornerstone of the whole faith of the church, is concerned with life. It is centered on the meaning of life. It seems as if such a starting point must lead somewhere. But the dialogue between the priest and our sin takes another turn. What do people think of me in the parish? The first question is almost identical with that of Jesus. Similarly, the priest asks too, "And you, what do you think of me? You are sin." No bursting confession follows upon this question. Arsène seems to hesitate, to look for an answer. His first words have nothing to do with the question. He talks about this or that, wonders what conversion means. He has never seen the phenomenon, but he and his family have all and always belonged to the church. They have all died properly, that is to say, after the last rites. Although, Arsène adds, when one is dead, everything is dead. Jesus' question brings to Peter the vision of a new life. The priest's question calls for an image of death and decay. There is no remedy to death or to decay, at least none that might be prescribed by the clergy, by the church, by Christianity. Western culture must look elsewhere if it wishes to find an alternative to its corrosion. At the hands of Christianity, it will suffocate more and more. The last rites are of no avail. Besides, they tell you that you are really dead. There is no remedy for death, for the death of the old order presided over by Christianity, and for the death of all that the country priest attempted to transform. Parallel with the agonizing attempts of the priest, there lurks one sign of hope in the texture of the novel. This hope stems from the personality of the defrocked priest, an old friend of the country priest. The reasons for his leaving the priesthood are not clearly stated. They do not need to be expressed, but the effects of his new orientation are unmistakably set forth. "You must have long since realized," he says to the country priest, "that I have, as they say, left the habit. My heart, though, has not changed. Only it is now open to a conception of life more human and consequently more generous." Is there in these words a suggestion of a remedy for the death of the old Christian culture of the West? What the country priest is seeking is also a more human and accordingly more abundant conception of existence. He too can be considered as a defrocked priest, spiritually, if not ecclesiastically. There is between their modes of life a rapport which the boundary of the church cannot obliterate. Whether within or without the church, within or without the ossified community of men called Christians, only one exit is available to those who realize the agony of Christianity. It lies in acknowledging the fact that Christianity has ceased to inform life, and moreover, that under the circumstances, it cannot hope to be able ever to do so again. What the dying country priest has found, and what caused the defrocked priest to leave the church, are one and the same thing. In theological language, it is expressed in the final words of the dying priest to his former colleague: "All is grace." It is in the name of this grace that the country priest has suffered and alienated himself from an ineffective Christianity. It is also in the name of the same grace that his former companion has left the physical community of Christianity. All is grace. These last words of the country priest constitute a critique of Christianity rather than of secularism. Bernanos criticizes Christianity by reason of his faith in God's presence, even in a world torn by inhuman passions. But the fact is that his novels almost universally describe a world in which one thing is evident, and that is God's absence. It is Christianity which is responsible for God's absence from the structures of Western culture. It is no use recalling that this culture owes its existence to Christianity. Today, the situation has so changed that one must rebel against Christianity, either if one wants to believe in God or if one wants to save Western culture from its progressive decay. The two priests of the diary represent these two possibilities. Here, then, is the significant dimension of religious novels similar to the diary or The Power and the Glory. In the last decades, there has been a resurgence of such novels. Almost always they portray as a central figure a priest whose actions take place in the context of a post-Christian era. The role of the priest is more prophetic than sacerdotal, just as it is more anti-clerical than clerical. A parallelism within the priest workers cannot fail to strike us. For the priests of the novel, as well as for the priest worker, the church is the stumbling block. If it often represents law and order, it also represents the petrified past. It sets itself aside from or above the contemporary condition of man, economically and culturally. In these so-called religious novels, it is not the church as an institution, but the priest as an individual who is the protagonist. No wonder André Blanchet bitterly complained that the treatment accorded the church, as he remarked that the church no longer occupies the center of the stage if it appears at all. The archbishop, who in Gilbert Cesbron's novel about the priest workers typified the old clerical view of Christianity, says reprovingly, "We are no longer the primitive church. We are the Roman Catholic Church." The priest figure in this type of novel is quite remote from the classical priest, who, consciously representing the official church, acted as spiritual director or omnicompetent manager. André Blanchet notes this point in his book on the priest and the contemporary novel. It is surprising to see that he does not realize his self-contradiction when, on the one hand, he welcomes this change, and on the other, he concedes that the old-type priest often was an obstacle, sealing off Christ from the faithful whose life he directed. Father Blanchet dislikes Bernanos' priest because he does not, in his estimation, adequately typify the normal diocesan priest, but resembles a monk let loose in a village or a simple layman touched by the Spirit. A Bernanos priest, says Father Blanchet, is more like a layman. All that he does, a layman could do too. Rather unexpectedly, Blanchet makes a distinction between a person who is God's witness and the one who is a minister, i.e. officer of the church. He regrets that the religious novel in general, and Bernanos in particular, prefer to deal with the witness rather than with the officer of the church. For André Blanchet, authentic existence cannot be severed from the old cultural moorings of which the church was the guardian. Bernanos, as well as Green and many others, is saying precisely the opposite. When the country priest on his deathbed hallows the life and the example of the defrocked priest by insisting that all is grace, he is acknowledging that authentic existence no longer depends upon one's membership in the church or upon one's allegiance to Christianity. Someone other than the defrocked priest, who according to canon law still remains a priest, could have administered the last rites, but that would have been against the expressed will of the dying country priest. In Francois Mariott's The Lamb, the protagonist is openly a former priest-to-be. Having changed the course of his life just as he is on his way to the seminary, he voluntarily gets involved in the conjugal difficulties of a young couple. He succeeds in helping them overcome their troubles and continues to live in their village, but not without coming under the unfriendly eye of the local priest. In the end, he dies in an accident which looks both like a murder and like a suicide. It is as if, having found authentic existence outside the church, he was prevented from living it to its fullest extent. He became alive only as he found a vocation outside the church, outside the pale of organized Christianity. Would it be an exaggeration to say that even as this young man found his true self after he turned away from his initial vocation, so also Western culture is trying to find its own self and shaking off the crippling shackles of a super-inundated Christianity? Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot is an invitation to shake off the fetters that still link Western man to a past Christian culture. The whole play is constructed around the irrelevance of Christian concepts and especially around the nonsensical or chaotic quality of Christian existence. Such existence is based on the belief that there is a God who particularly cares for man and is ever loving and concerned enough to enter the scene of man's destiny. Two of the characters, Gogo and Didi, wait for him to do so. Somehow God never quite manifests himself. What remains of him and the fatigued imagination of those who wait for him is a caricature of his tamed majesty. That is why he is called Godot, the ending of that name having a diminutive connotation. Godot is a symbol of man's vacuous and errant imagination, Man clings in his mind to the symbol as if he could not do without it. In actuality, he could live without it just as well. And the passage about a summer honeymoon on the shores of the Dead Sea, Gogo stresses the anachronism of Christian existence. Symbolically, nothing could more derisively and decisively convey the feeling that Christianity is indeed a dead alternative to man's contemporary predicament, a dead end to his quest for life. The texts that are bound between the covers of the Bible have no contemporary meaning whatever for Gogo, and presumably they have none for modern man. Using a Christian theme and symbolism, Beckett points to a Christianity whose God has become for Christians an emotional outlet and nothing more. Christians do not behave in relation to their God in any better way than do Gogo and Didi in relation to their Godot. In Beckett's eyes, Christians have actually made their God into a Godot. If then, from a biblical point of view, Beckett's Godot has all the attributes of an idol, Christians must now ask themselves whether or not they are guilty of idolatry. In point of fact, Gogo and Didi are the average Christian watching the play. But Beckett masterfully prevents him from effecting such a substitution. He forces him to face the irrelevance of Christianity. Beckett successfully achieves this end by reversing the meaning of the Christian symbols. These symbols, by virtue of their sacramental nature, stress the necessity of cleansing natural man. With Beckett, they point to the urgency of cleansing cultural Christian man, with a view to bringing out natural man. As Thoreau, Whitman, and Transcendentalism, i.e. Puritanism upside down, use the Bible with the intention of divesting Puritanism of any intrinsic worth, so Beckett uses Christianity in order to point out its anachronism. His dexterity has the sharp effectiveness of Sartre's laconic salutation in an address to newspapermen gathered in Geneva after the war. Gentlemen, God is dead. All is grace because God is dead. The counter effect of Christian influence on Western man can be measured by going from Waiting for Godot to Archibald MacLeish's J.B. Godot, or the substitute God with whom Beckett seems even less satisfied than with the Christian God, is the real source of the modern Job's tragedy as conceived by MacLeish. Beckett, who does not believe in God, believes even less in Godot. MacLeish, on the contrary, seems to be saying that Godot is all that there is of God. In Beckett's play, it is clearly intimated that Godot lives only in man's imagination. But MacLeish constructs his play around this second-hand God by inviting us to thank man's imagination for allowing Godot to come into existence. Beckett reveals and pleads for everything that man has to gain from abandoning all atavistic attachment to a deity. His is a thoroughgoing humanism, more like Camus than like Sartre's. But MacLeish's humanism is more like Sartre's than like Camus. With Sartre, MacLeish declares that if God existed, man could not bear not being that God. Beckett is thus psychologizing God away, while MacLeish deifies man. The distance between biblical man and post-Christian man can be shown by comparing Job and J.B. Job's predicament is that, though he believes in God, he acts at times as if he doubted. But he cannot be convinced by his doubt. At the end, his tragedy comes to the point. Without God, man would be nothing. J.B.'s predicament is that he does not believe in God, but acts as if he does, or wishes he did. At the end of his tragic life, he clearly states that without man, there would be no God. The first characteristic of wisdom literature is its existential, the word quite appropriate, concern for man and his destiny. But this concern about the meaning of existence does not evolve into a theory about history or about the future. Human existence is even viewed in such a way that this view gives the impression of being too simple. According to it, existence is authenticated by the antinomy between wisdom and folly. Furthermore, wisdom is a concomitant of piety, and piety, or grace, is another face of justice, whether human or divine. Therefore, wisdom is also a reflection of God's wisdom. There is, then, a strict correlation between man's wisdom and God's wisdom, man's justice and God's justice. If God is good, he is just, and his justice is neither blind nor a mere theologumenon. That is, God's justice stands revealed in the wisdom and piety of man, in the pious, the graceful life. Wisdom literature shows a further dimension of its depth. Human experience belies the correlation between man's wisdom and God's wisdom. Between man's justice and God's justice, the just man suffers. What does this mean? For wisdom literature, God's justice is something more than retributive justice, and the wisdom of God is something other than the total of man's wisdom. This leads to a tragic view of life. But the tragic element has uncommon quality. Its source is not to be found in the mystery of evil or the frustration of man's action, but in the fact that both the justice and the injustice, the wisdom and the folly of man invariably point to the otherness of God, despite, or precisely because of, the underlying correlation between God's and man's wisdom. Even in faith, God remains wholly other than man. One cannot therefore deduce God's existence from the amount of justice in the world, or deny it because of evil and human suffering. The tragic sense of life, according to biblical thought, lies in the fact that suffering, that human experience as a whole, is what separates man from himself. Theologically speaking, the presence of God is a mystery or an abyss. From this angle, human experience appears as the threat to existence, as the possibility of self-alienation. Above and beyond this threat, and redeeming man from it, there is the affirmation of God's faithfulness to man. Irrational as this view may seem, it follows another logic than that of logic, that of human experience. It is an analytic description of, not a theory about, human existence. Faith, therefore, is the response of the wise man's vision that all is grace. It cannot be justified by any theory of reward and punishment. Faith is not a justification of reasons, good or bad, nor is God reasons, as he is claimed to be at the beginning of Miglish's J.B. The Book of Job and J.B. represent two conceptions of man which are worlds apart. God is just becomes, in today's secular version, God is reasons. He is the cosmic pal. He can be useful. J.B. says, I've always known that God was with me. He is good to me. God is on J.B.'s side. He is just about all the good things that J.B. is. He is the spit-and image of J.B. He is so many reasons that he does not really exist in the beginning of the play, just as J.B. himself exists only as a figment, or at best, potentially, until his tragedies begin to unfold. It is only gradually that, as the problem of God's existence becomes more explicit, God seems to take on flesh. The problem that J.B. proposes to solve, and does solve in its manner toward the end, is lodged in the compound proposition that God, if he is God, is not good, and that if he is good, he is not God. J.B. himself indicates the origin as well as the implication of this dilemmatic riddle by stating that man's innocence and the existence of God are mutually exclusive. This statement is echoed by Sarah's question and the affirmative answer it implies, when she asks whether God purchases his innocence at the expense of man's. Not without some existential reminiscences, the caustic Nichols too describes man's condition according to the current zeitgeist. Man's life is not of his own choosing, nor is his presumed guilt, with or without the euphemism of God's mercy. Man is the lonely and innocent proprietor of his own dirty self. The thesis of J.B. seems, at first, to revolve around the following proposition. The meaning of existence is to justify God. Man is, therefore God is. God is reasons declares thus in the beginning of the play. At the end, when J.B. has received his dirty self back, he can say God is. As in biblical thought, there is a correlation between man's wisdom and God's, between God and man. But now God depends upon man for his existence, and that is not all. If man is nothing except perhaps God's creator, his guilt is precisely that he has created God. God is unthinkable if we are innocent. God is, but must be justified at the expense of man's misery. And man is the more miserable, the more he tries to justify this God whom he has created. Is there no alternative to this absurd existence? There is. For the play then modifies its thesis and insinuates this question: why should man, like a Sisyphus, continually attempt to justify God, especially if all he seeks to accomplish is to find his own raison d'etre? Could it not be that his predicament in justifying God is not really related to his raison d'etre? Why try to prove God if all that man needs is to be himself? Why seek God if all that man wants is love? Anyway, is not this quest for God just a quest for love? Sarah expresses this point of view by stating that she could not help JB anymore, that his God is a God of justice, but there is no justice. A just God has nothing to do with life. Existence is moved by another force, love, which God is lacking. For to JB, God does not love, he only is. In the biblical perspective, God is love because he is. A God who is and does not love and is not faithful to man might as well be dead. Though he is, JB's God, or rather JB's Godot, is dead. But the man who seeks love must also seek justice, and therefore he creates God. A strange paradox, if it is one, remains. Man needs to create for himself a God on whom he depends for all things. This God, if he exists, depends on man for one thing even more important than his being, since man cannot ascertain it. God depends on man for love. This one thing cancels out all the others, especially those things for which man depends on God, or because of which he conceives God. Does not man's capacity for love ultimately cancel out God himself? As Sarah says, there is neither justice nor divine love. There is only human love. Job, in the biblical myth, could not understand suffering and evil because for him God's existence was not in question. But JB, or post-Christian man, does not understand evil and suffering because God does not really exist except theoretically. For him, only love is. And it is when it is freely given in spite of suffering, of injustice, of death, and finally, of God. And yet in the face of God's uselessness, this love paradoxically justifies Godot, any Godot. To the virility of love succeeds a sheer sentimentality. Actually, it is not the question of God or of religious existence that preoccupies the contemporary mind, but a materialistic question of utility, of success. For example, there is no giving of thanks in JB's family at the Thanksgiving dinner. The dinner does not stress any God-centered family life. JB does not consider his position and his family affluence as a blessing from God. The dinner simply demonstrates that all that wealth is the product of JB's craft and skill. He could not be bothered by his spiritual mediocrity. He is not even conscious of it. The cult of reassurance and success is the promoter of the recent revival of religion. McLeish is right in interpreting the predicament of the modern Job in terms of that cult. Outside of the religiosity which hovers over JB, there is another aspect of the play which equally clearly situates it in a time withdrawn from the influence of Christianity. JB is a modern tragedy. Yet the tragic element itself is rather thin and insufficiently convincing, even if the events that disturb the middle-class tranquility of JB are rather cataclysmic. But a succession of misfortunes is not a tragedy. Certainly, it is not there that one would seek the elements of a tragedy. One would seek it in the human attitude assumed by JB in the midst of his vicissitudes. This attitude is not quite correlated with the supposed tragic intensity of the events. The reason for this lack of correlation is not so much the superficiality of JB's plight, which is indeed a little too technological, as the inescapable feeling that the adversities which fall upon him do not ultimately affect his self-understanding. It is not the events themselves that should contain the tragic element so much as JB's self-understanding. No spectator would need the theatrical succession of sound and fury to realize that JB's tragedy is a false tragedy. Either no tragedy is possible today because the present age is neither Greek nor Christian, or If JB or any other similar play is to be seen as a tragedy, then it is a new form of tragedy, which bears no resemblance either to the Greek or to the Christian conception. In the Greek conception, necessity determines the tragic course of human existence. Beyond the problem of necessity and freedom, or determinism and free will, the fatalistic character of the Greek tragedy results from the fundamental dualism underlying the Greek concept of life. Against this background, the inescapable sequence of tragic events which falls upon the individual corresponds to the Greek attempt to express the unity of human existence. With or without the God's favor, life is one. In the Christian view, the concept of man's freedom adds a new dimension to the relationship between God and man. Therefore, the Christian view is neither dualistic nor monistic, but it has an equal apprehension of the unity of human existence. The tragedy consists in that instead of this kind of life, one could lead that kind of life. Both the Greek and the Christian concepts are religious and supernaturalistic. They necessitate an absolute, or at least the existence of a principle other than the human. But supernatural beliefs have today lost their relevance. No attempt to find their equivalents inside the framework of a self-contained human existence will produce a satisfactory alternative either to the Greek or the Christian conception of tragedy. As Camus realized, to posit the absurdity of life is not enough. It is not even a pure negation, and is consequently only a penultimate cry of despair before the ultimate affirmation of life. Suicide would be the only form of tragedy that could possibly have some plausibility. But before he committed suicide, man would have to deny that he has any meaning, and the tragedy would lose its plausibility. In a golden age of religiosity, there is less and less room for a tragic conception of life. The disappearance of tragedy is further evident in the portrayal of a Christ figure as the central character in so many contemporary novels. While the literary effects, even the religious ones, can be tremendous, the theological implication is disastrous. The Christ figure is a result of the process of leveling down. If all is grace, any man can take on the marks of Christ, and Christ, the unique, according to Christian theology, becomes a mere mask, suitable to any man. The Christ figure is but another devaluation of Christianity. It is expressive of the broad secularization of Christian concepts whose content has been hollowed out. The humanization of God, or the deification of man which takes place in many ideologies, from communism to some forms of existentialism, indeed goes hand in hand with the secularization of Christ and the assimilation of Christianity with a culture which ipso facto is less and less Christian. There is a deeper level in the predicament of modern man, which J.B. reflects by dealing neither with the problem of being nor with that of suicide. There is no better proof than this lacuna that the illusion of an afterlife has no hold over modern man. The master of this world, and constantly beset by imponderables, man may not feel a sense of deliverance from evil or from the oppression of non-being, but at least he feels bound to something, namely the possibility of circumventing the absurd. Modern man is neither awed by the death of God nor perplexed by the problem of suicide. He is represented neither by Nietzsche nor by Camus. For Nietzsche, the death of God meant a feeling of deliverance, and for Camus, it leaves man confronted with the only real philosophical problem, that of suicide. Either way, both express their thought in terms of the cultural approach to man's self-understanding, which, though peripherally, still is influenced by Christianity. The death of God supposedly liberated man from the problem of understanding himself in terms of a transcendental allegiance to a supernatural power unable to justify the evil of this world. From probing the problem of suicide, there may emerge an affirmation of life or the necessity of self-transcendence as the essence of life. This still poses the problem of man in the framework of transcendence, even though the latter is now neither supernaturalistic nor futuristic. Transcendence in Nietzsche and Camus only indicates a desperate effort to overcome despair. Love, however, finite and concrete love, is more adequate and apt to overcome despair. Not that love can finally become the condition of existence, but that it may do so once again, as Camus would say, or only once more. J.B. is neither Sisyphus nor one of Dostoevsky's characters tormented about the death of God. The idea of suicide never arises on his destitute horizon, nor does he ever think of usurping God's place, since for him there is no transcendental God. In spite of the thunder and the catastrophes, J.B. is more like Gide's Nathaniel than like Sisyphus or Ivan Karamazov or Kirillov. It is less problematic to assert life and to go on living when man is confronted with God's silence, as J.B. advocates, and one can always find a substitute, than it is when man is confronted with the silence of the world, for which there is no substitute. More like Don Juan than like anyone else, J.B. conquers and wastes. He is neither committed to others nor a derelict and alienated from others. For him, existence is not a tragedy. He denies that it should be. This may be the greatest illusion to replace the Christian vision of life. Illusion or not, it has succeeded to the illusion of an afterlife. The religiosity manifested in J.B. is narcissistic. Though it deals with a God which is nothing other than love itself, this God or this love is a purely human phenomenon. It is not an absolute above and beyond man. It does not confront man with a transcendental reality wholly other than himself. Sinfulness or anxiety before that which threatens man from the outside is totally absent from J.B.'s moral struggle. In theological words, he does not stand before God. He does not have to choose between a relative and the absolute, between the transitory and the permanent, between God and reasons. In J.B., man may no longer afford the luxury of thinking himself the measure of all things. He may even turn his back on the sentimental and immanental theism of the 19th century, centered on the cult of God's fatherhood and the brotherhood of men. A certain God may have become the measure of J.B.'s existence, his affections and his struggles, and his predicament. But it is a God who reflects the image of man all too faithfully. Besides, what else could this God be, since the contemporary framework of man's self-understanding is, as J.B. shows, no longer transcendental?